A young dark-haired girl with large, surprised, amber-colored eyes sat on a bed, surrounded by a small group of people. The tired man, apparently a doctor, sighed heavily and said that she had lost her memory. The girl didn't know these people gathered around her, and this place didn't look like Korea at all, so fear mixed with genuine bewilderment was growing inside her. Suddenly, the last thing she remembered before she found herself here crashed into her head. Then, without suspecting anything, she crossed the road, looking at the screen of her smartphone and not noticing anything around her. Then suddenly, there was the roar of an engine. The headlights of a truck blinded her before she felt a powerful impact, and then the world went dark. However, now her body was completely fine, which meant that due to the fact that she was hit by a truck, she was reborn in another world. It seems that now she will have to live in this place. On the street, she was met by the cheerful laughter of the maids. The girl walked past them sedately, proudly alone. One of the maids was holding a basket full of washed laundry. Suddenly, a strong wind blew, quickly picking up the linen and throwing one of the scarves straight into the girl's face. Noticing this, the maids immediately stopped laughing and stared at her in horror, as if awaiting a verdict. They immediately rushed to bow and apologize, trembling with fear. The girl, taking the scarf from her face, smiled radiantly and gently calmed the frightened maids. They looked at each other in bewilderment. Turning back to her, they, almost in tears, expressed surprise that their mistress Elle treated them with such respect and asked her to behave in a way that she was comfortable with. Ignoring their pleas and focusing only on the name that was now hers, she wondered why Elle's name sounded so familiar. Finally remembering, she cried out in surprise, frightening the maids even more. Ella, whose full name was Laella Randmeiken, was one of the characters in Romfant's Love Blooms in the Desert. Despite the simple plot, the girl really enjoyed reading this book because of the author's amazing style. And now she has entered the body of the character in this book. Now everything fell into place, and it became clear why the maids were panicky afraid of her. Elle had always been cruel and ruthless towards those she didn't like. It's no wonder no one liked her. Even her parents weren't particularly interested in her. In the book, Laella Randmeiken was definitely the villain, a vain character who thought she would naturally become queen. But when the king fell in love with the main character, Laella immediately began to pursue her and even tried to poison her so that she would disappear once and for all. The girl sighed and said out loud that, whatever the case, Laella was not such a terrible villain. The maids looked at each other in bewilderment, wondering if their mistress was really okay, especially since she was getting married soon. Intrigued, Elle moved closer to them, asking what kind of wedding they were talking about. They fearfully explained that in 3 days she must marry the second prince of the Ren Empire. Stunned by this news, Elle screams, not understanding how she can suddenly become a married woman. In the book, the Empire of Rennes was mentioned when the war began, but the state was not particularly notable and eventually failed and fell apart. Because of this situation with the country, she had to get married. Although the second prince was not even mentioned in the book, he would not inherit the throne, so Elle, at the wedding altar, nervously wondered if she should have married him in such a hurry, in the dead of night. And there were no guests. Even the emperor did not come to his son's wedding. She looked at the prince with alarm, wondering if he really was ugly since he didn't show his face. Even though it was a forced marriage, I would have liked the prince to at least be handsome. After the ceremony is over, the princess is taken to her new room, and she is pleased to note its beauty and decoration. A smiling maid named Lari said that she would prepare a place for her to sleep. However, Elle refused, saying that she would do everything herself because she felt sorry for the maids, who were accustomed to cruel treatment. She wondered where that man was now. It was such a shame to leave the bride all alone on the first night, and apparently he was marrying against his will. Elle asked Lari when the prince would arrive, to which she shuddered. The maid hesitated, not daring to tell the truth. The girl asked her in surprise what had happened. Gathering her strength, Lari finally said that perhaps the prince would not come at all. A shocked Elle falls to her knees with a grim look, not believing that he left her right after he got married. The agitated maid rushes to lift her up, and the girl sullenly thinks that perhaps this is for the best. It is so tiresome to live with someone whose character may be incompatible, and then it would be better not to meet until they die. However, when the prince did not show up even after a month, The girl irritably noted that this was too much. Turning to Larry, she asked a question that had been intriguing her for a long time, namely, how ugly was the prince? The surprised maid hesitated, not knowing how to answer her. Elle said she was willing to put up with everything, but she was really turned off by the ugliness, so it was important for her to know the answer to her question. Larry asked, embarrassed, if the princess hadn't heard anything about him. She shares that, although she has not seen him in person, she has heard rumors that during the day, the prince takes the form of a monster. Imagining a huge fanged mouth, Elle recoiled, horrified that her husband was a monster. Larry continues that, according to rumors, when the prince was little, he was cursed by an evil wizard. That's why he always hid from others during the day. Elle understands that this is why the prince married her in such a hurry. She irritably reflects on how it was possible to marry off her daughter, who suffers from memory loss, to a man doomed to always turn into a monster at dawn. At night, the princess suddenly woke up. The moonlight was brightly flooding the room. It was still too early to get up, and Elle sat up in bed, rubbing her eyes tiredly. She thoughtfully directed her gaze out the window, watching the night landscape unfold before her, and realizing that a month had already passed since she had entered the book. So then she did die after all. Thinking about this, she clutched the blanket in excitement, wondering if she would ever be able to return to her home world. Elle quietly left her room, wrapping herself in a shawl, her head still unable to comprehend what had happened to her. But she decided to first learn more about this place. Walking through the night garden, silvered by the moon, the girl suddenly realized that she had gone too far. Her gaze was met by a stunningly beautiful body of water, washing over towering smooth rocks. She couldn't help but wonder if this was really still the Imperial Palace. There were no guards around, and only a lone fluffy dog lay peacefully at the roots of a tree. Noticing her, Elle screamed in surprise, frightening the dog, who instantly woke up from his sleep. He bared his teeth angrily at her, letting out a warning growl. Realizing it was just a dog, Elle breathed a sigh of relief. However, there was something strange in the dog's behavior. Although he growled threateningly, it didn't look like he was going to attack and bite her. The girl spoke to him kindly, saying that she would not touch him. At these words, the dog instantly relaxed and lay back down in his place, lazily closing his eyes. The sight of a calm dog was soothing, and because of this special atmosphere, the princess suddenly felt lethargic. She woke up when the sun had already risen high above the horizon. Some voice was persistently calling her, tearing her out of her sweet dreams. With difficulty opening her eyes, she was perplexed to find a sobbing Larry and several nervous soldiers around her. Seeing that the princess had finally woken up, Larry rushed towards her in tears, lamenting that she had really been attacked. Confident in her conclusions, she cried out menacingly, "Who dared to do this?" And the soldiers took up her words, asking Elle to point out the identity of the non-existent attacker. She tried to explain everything, but they didn't let her get a word in, continuing to insist on the attack. Unable to bear it, Elle, burning with embarrassment, shouted that she had simply fallen asleep. There was an awkward silence. Larry respectfully thanked the soldiers for their assistance, while Elle was practically dying of shame. She walked quickly back to the palace, and the maid, barely able to keep up with her, ran after her, lamenting that she was afraid, because she thought that something had happened to the princess, and that there was a commotion in the castle because of her disappearance. Elle stopped suddenly and asked if anyone in the palace kept a dog. Larry shook her head in surprise. This made the girl wonder what kind of dog she had met in that case. That night, the princess couldn't sleep again. She went out into the garden again, laughing and exhaling that she was looking for that dog because she had nothing else to do. It was strange that Larry said she had never seen dogs here, and Elle wondered if it could have been a dog from another palace. Her feet carried her to the same pond as the previous night, and there on the shore, she suddenly saw someone's silhouette. Surprised, she asked the stranger who he was. When he silently turned to face her, Elle recognized him as her husband. The man remained sullenly silent. The girl thought that she didn't even know his name. She turned to him again, but he, without listening to her, quickly rushed away. Elle looked after him with confusion, wondering what that was all about. The next day, the princess kept wondering why her husband ran away so abruptly as soon as he saw her. Sighing, she concluded that perhaps he was used to avoiding people because of the curse of turning into a monster during the day. But either way, She didn't care about her husband. Suddenly, her eyes widened as she saw a familiar sight. In the cool shade of the spreading trees, a fluffy snow-white dog snored sweetly. Elle immediately squatted down in front of her, looking happily at the animal. Amber eyes glowed with admiration. Giving in to a fleeting desire, she reached out to stroke the shiny fur. The dog, sensing movement above his body, suddenly opened his eyes. The girl immediately recoiled with a scream, looking in horror at the awakened beast. He, just like last time, growled deep in his throat. Elle, with a hint of guilt in her voice, carefully said that she wouldn't touch him. Suddenly, Larry's shout was heard from behind. The dog happily peeked out from behind the girl's body, looking at the maid without any threat. Larry said in surprise that indeed, as the lady had said, there was a dog here, to which Elle asked how it could have gotten here. The maid suggested that it might have been Mr. Shirth's dog, and Elle asked again, puzzled. Larry awkwardly said that Shirt was the prince's name. Reacting indifferently to this information, Elle offered to take the dog to the castle. It was impossible to just leave her on the street, especially since this dog was lonely. There was no one around at all, and this reminded the girl very much of her own situation. While carefully soaping the dog in the bathtub, Elle came up with the nickname Tofu. She spoke affectionately to Tofu, asking if he liked his new name. She said softly that if he wanted to live in the palace, he would have to become cleaner. The girl was enjoying the process to the fullest, smiling brightly. She asks the dog if she should join him. Elle begins to undress, carefully pulling the sleeve of her dress down her thin shoulder. The dog suddenly became alarmed. To the girl's surprise, he jumped out of the bathroom like a bullet, rushing towards the door. Tofu began to scratch the door desperately, showing that he wanted to get out immediately. Elle, perplexed, immediately rushed to the prankster. Hearing a loud scraping sound, Larry, determined to protect Mrs., rushed inside, and the dog, taking advantage of the opportunity, quickly slipped into the room. Noticing movement to her left, Larry glanced back in bewilderment. Disappointed in her whole life, Elle's face darkened. While carefully wiping Tofu with a terry towel, Elle gently asked him what had happened to make him lose all his previous calm so suddenly. She thoughtfully suggested that perhaps the dog simply didn't like to swim. Suddenly, the girl sneezes with all her might. A worried Larry wonders if she has caught a cold. Elle waves her hand that she's fine, but then she sneezes loudly again. Larry sternly put the girl to bed, and she, lying in bed, thinks about how inconvenient it is here due to the lack of modern hospitals. Suddenly, she hears Tofu's faint barking somewhere nearby. The dog looked at her sadly, whining quietly. The princess tries to calm him down, saying that it was not because of him that she fell ill. She patted the bed next to her, inviting Tofu to sleep with her. He jumped up happily, landing right on top of her. They fell asleep hugging each other. The last thing the girl thought about before falling asleep was that she really liked feeling the warmth of someone alive next to her. As the rays of the dawn sun penetrated the room through the window, Elle lazily opened her eyes. Something strange appeared before her still blurred vision. Finally opening her eyes, she saw a handsome, fair-haired man lying there, peacefully sleeping at her side. She widened her eyes in shock, hanging there for a couple of seconds. Slowly, the realization dawned on her that a half-naked, unfamiliar man was sleeping next to her, and she had absolutely no idea who he was or how he had ended up there. He too began to wake up, slowly opening his eyes. Shifting his gaze, he met the eyes of the shocked girl. The man was dumbfounded, and his gaze showed noticeable anxiety. Coming out of his stupor, he immediately jumped out of bed. The stranger quickly rushed from the spot, ignoring Elle's cries of protest, thinking only about how to quickly escape. The girl's head was completely empty after such a morning adventure. However, then followed a deafening female scream about a pervert. Ella was walking through the garden with Tofu when an excited Larry ran up to her. She asked worriedly about the morning incident with the pervert, to which the princess assured the maid that everything was fine. Elle was concerned about the lack of security nearby and wondered what might be the reason for it. After all, it was an empire. It couldn't be that they didn't have enough budget. She asked Larry who was in charge of the palace budget. She gently patted Tofu on the head and listened to the maid's reply that the chamberlain must be doing this. Elle had never seen this chamberlain before, and the maid was quick to answer. The thing was that Larry had been here relatively recently, so she couldn't give an exact answer. And in fact, Before Laela's arrival, the servants weren't having the best time. Elle smirked skeptically, asking if Lari had ever thought that she would quarrel with the chamberlain, to which she nervously replied that she never thought that Laela was evil. The princess assured that there was no need to panic so much, and that she just wanted to meet with the chamberlain. Tofu suddenly whined, and Elle worriedly asked him what was wrong. She asked if he was really so dissatisfied with the chamberlain. She stared at the dog, not understanding what was wrong with him. The girl continued to throw out options of what Tofu could be worried about, but he remained silent, looking at her attentively. There is one last possible option left. When she mentioned the pervert, the dog barked affirmatively. Ella was very surprised, looking at Tofu with bewilderment. She repeated her words again, and the dog growled menacingly. His whole appearance showed that he was ready to protect her at any cost. The girl couldn't resist and hugged Tofu, melting from such care from the dog. Her emotion was interrupted by the thought that the chamberlain was probably not very busy, and she would need to find him and talk to him. A few days later, the chamberlain was leisurely drinking tea in the company of his servants. Elle came to visit him with Larry to talk. However, a serious young servant blocked her path, declaring that she could not go there now. She smiled and said that he should know who she was. The servants looked at each other nervously. Imitating the character of the book Laela, the girl crossed her arms in displeasure and asked with irritation if she needed to be explained who she was. They bowed their heads respectfully to the princess, and she demanded to let her through. Tofu barked furiously, listening to the girl. The servant shouted harshly at the dog. Unable to contain herself from such treatment, Elle gave him a sharp, resounding slap in the face. The second servant, Lari and Tofu, who did not expect such a development of events, stared at them in shock, not believing their eyes. The enraged Ella paid no attention to them, scolding the servant for speaking so carelessly to her dog. While the second servant helps the humiliated man to stand up, the girl reflects on how this would be unacceptable in Korea. Before this, when she was in the kingdom of Sahad for a few days, all the maids there helped her. Here, Lari did everything alone. Be that as it may, Tofu was much more valuable to her than all these servants. She was surprised by her own thoughts. But then she looked at the dog. Gently patting him on the top of his head, she realized that she simply couldn't help but like such a cutie. Suddenly, the girl remembered something. Neither Lari nor Tofu were originally in the book, and the fact that Laela married a representative of the Ren Empire was already radically different from the story. Soon the princess was taken to the chamberlain. He frowned with displeasure when he saw them. He turned to Larry irritably, reminding her that he had personally intended to approach the princess, to which she responded in fear that several days had passed since then. The man was not satisfied with this answer, and, losing his temper, he began to shout at the maid for daring to contradict him. His tirade was interrupted by Elle, who spoke rudely to the chamberlain. The man turned around to look at her in amazement at such impudence. Book Laela was a very tough person. She didn't think about the feelings of others. So the girl, realizing that the only way to put the chamberlain in his place was to imitate the heroine, boldly continued. She clenched her fist tightly, looking menacingly into the man's eyes. To everyone's surprise, she angrily hit him right in the face. The servants, frightened by the princess's behavior, covered their mouths with their hands in amazement. Lari was calm. She only carefully covered Tofu's eyes. Scarlet blood gushed from the chamberlain's nose. He fell off the chair with a dull thud, screaming loudly in pain and clutching the bridge of his nose. Elle looked at his suffering with disdain. The man stood up and shouted that he would not leave this alone. However, he was met only with a stern look from the princess, who declared that he was nobody. She coldly asked who he could report her to, whether there was some nobleman behind him, or whether he was going to inform the emperor and empress. She didn't care. Finally, the shamed chamberlain, whose name was Kapari, sullenly agreed to negotiate. Laela asked without emotion if it was right for him to manage the palace budget. Before Kapari could answer, the girl demanded that he transfer the rights to her, stunning the man. Originally, the budget was managed by the prince's agreement, but since the prince could only handle matters at night, the chamberlain must rule during the day, and Elle wasn't going to let that go. The chamberlain nervously asked her if she was good at calculating expenses. She coldly answered the question with a question, asking if women in the empire did not study mathematics. She continued indifferently that she had been taught this in the kingdom since early childhood. The man irritably asked her to prove her abilities. He promised that if she proved herself capable, he would hand over the budget management rights to her. However, this was not enough for the girl. Kapari lived in the best palace, and Elle demanded to switch places with her if she won. Being sure that the girl would not cope with difficult tasks, he said that then she would have to try very hard. With a grin, he began asking her simple arithmetic problems, to which the girl gave the correct answers with a bored look. The chamberlain was completely horrified that she answered everything so easily. The girl, who had expected something much more complicated, thought that he was probably making fun of her, because she could decide something like that while lying in bed. Slamming his fist on the table, Kapari shouted in dismay that the princess couldn't possibly be that good at math, only to feel a sharp pain as Tofu fiercely grabbed his leg. He tried to throw the dog off without much success, yelping in pain, and Elle watched this picture with satisfaction. With his leg bandaged, the chamberlain sat sullenly on the bed, thinking hard. How could he hand over the power he had sought for so long to a princess from another country? A memory comes to mind of how, after his loss, he declared that no matter what, he could not leave the palace. But the girl easily replied that if he did not mind living with her under the same roof, then he could stay. A dog growled angrily nearby, defending its owner. Clenching his hand into a fist, Kapari made a furious decision to kill this bastard. He orders the maid to keep an eye on everything the princess does from now on. At the same time, Elle falls onto her new bed with relief, and a joyful Tofu jumps on it after her. The girl enthusiastically asks the dog if he likes the new room, and he barks affirmatively. Now that the princess was out of that dirty palace, she felt her depression was gone. Larry was genuinely happy for her mistress, smiling good-naturedly. She noted that Elle became much happier after Tofu appeared. Layla yawns tiredly. Today has left her pretty tired. Before falling asleep, she asks Larry not to leave if she is suddenly asked to leave her for another palace, and says that she will protect her and Tofu. The next day, Elle is sorting through reports in her new office. The latest report attracts particular attention. The girl asks Larry what she has been eating all this time. Lost in thought, the maid lists everything Elle ate. The princess shows her a report stating that 1,000,000 gold pieces were spent on food and 300,000 on maintaining the property, and asks why food is so expensive and who spends the money on maintaining the property. Larry replies that Kapari was the one doing all this, and Elle sighs heavily, realizing that there is corruption involved. Suddenly, she hears strange sounds and looks away in confusion. Tofu, instantly jumping up from his place, barked menacingly, looking intently ahead. He rushed from his place to the door, and the hostess hurried after him. As she left the room, she saw him attack the frightened maid, continuing to growl loudly. There was real horror in the poor girl's eyes. Elle asked menacingly if Kapari had sent her to follow her. The maid bowed her head to her and introduced herself as Lena, saying that she was simply cleaning the main palace. But Layla remained adamant, coldly asking why she was hanging around here in that case and not in the hall. With a frightening look, the girl orders her to leave and tell Kopari not to pull any more stupid tricks. She watches with satisfaction as Lena hurries away. Suddenly, she notices Tofu's happy face, and her expression instantly changes. She happily hugs him, praising him for his immediate reaction. She continues to be touched and say how handsome and smart Tofu is, and then tries to kiss him, but the dog pushes her away with his paws. Elle wonders if he doesn't like kissing. The next morning, the girl does not find the dog next to her, and in fear begins to search. She didn't know where he always went at night, but in the morning he always returned at the same time. But today, this did not happen. Larry said that she searched the entire corridor, but the dog was nowhere to be found. Elle was noticeably nervous, worried about the loss of her beloved dog. Larry tried to calm the lady down, suggesting that he had gone out for a walk. However, Elle was worried that Kapari might have done something to him. Larry was horrified by this suggestion. Layla was haunted by the way the chamberlain had looked at him the day before. Despite the power Kapari has in the palace, he still wouldn't dare be rude to the princess. But that wouldn't work with a dog. After all, in this world, dogs were treated like unnecessary trash. She wanted to go to Kopari right away and see if Tofu was there. But if he wasn't there, that would only make the situation worse. Having collected her thoughts, with eyes burning with fury, she asked Larry to go to the chamberlain and tell him that she was not interested in all these aristocratic games. and if something happened to Tofu, he would be in trouble. Then she asked if Larry knew where she could meet the prince. The maid replied that even the chamberlain did not know the answer to this question. She nervously explains that the nanny used to take care of the prince, but then she was falsely accused and thrown out of the palace, and no one knew anything about the prince anymore. Before the prince was cursed, the nanny was the only one who was close to him. The princess asked in bewilderment, "What about the emperor then?" Larry sadly replied that the emperor was not interested in the second prince and did not even come here. It was getting late. The prince would soon become human again, so Elle made a firm decision to find him. However, the Imperial domain was much larger than she thought, and it turned out not to be so easy. She couldn't use the servants and maids because they were helping Kapari. There were only 3 or 4 people with whom she could find Tofu and the prince, but even they were slowly starting to get tired. Eventually, the girl resigned herself and invited the maids to return. Larry was surprised by Layella's proposal and asked what about the prince and Tofu. To this, the princess declared that this would not do, and she would ask the duke for help. It was deep night, and at this time, Elle was writing a letter to the duke. Even though her parents married her off to a monster, it's unlikely they would have refused to help her. Suddenly, the door creaks open, and an excited Larry runs inside, distracting the girl. She anxiously reports that a letter has arrived, personally written by His Majesty the Emperor. The letter stated that the Empress wished Layella to come to the palace as soon as possible, and the Emperor sent his chamberlain and knights to escort her. The letter didn't say anything about why they wanted to see her, but the girl didn't care, and she smiled mysteriously. This was a great opportunity to ask the Emperor for help, and also to tell him about what Kapari had done, so she asks Larry to tell her that she is leaving tomorrow. Morning came. Elle is awakened by something wet and rough touching her cheek, and she reluctantly opens her eyes. Something white and fluffy appears before the blurry gaze. Suddenly, she finally woke up and saw Tofu alive and well in front of her, looking at her intently. Jumping up suddenly, she rushes to hug the missing dog, with wet eyes, lamenting how worried she was. Suddenly, she notices that Tofu has hurt his paw and calls out to Larry in alarm. Together, they treat his wound, trying not to hurt the dog. Larry cries out in anger, "Did Kapari do it?" Without a second thought, Elle calmly replies that he wouldn't dare. Hearing a reasonable question about who dared in this case, the girl plunges into thought. She promises herself not to hold back or get upset anymore. She needs to become angrier and stronger. This way she can protect those she loves. She tells Larry that, as planned, she will go to the Emperor, so she asks her to prepare everything. She will not be just the daughter of a duke from another country. She will show that she is a real princess and restore her rights. Larry, filled with enthusiasm, happily supports the girl and suggests starting with choosing a dress. Despite the maid's enthusiastic speeches, the princess is not so inspired. She asks Larry about the dress in surprise. However, when the maid takes her to a spacious hall filled with a variety of lush dresses and expensive jewelry, Larry's passion is transmitted to her. The maid, with a happy smile, shows her the jewelry that Layella loved before she lost her memory. The light from the multicolored stones almost blinds Elle. Shielding her eyes from the bright glare, she reflects on how in the book Layella only wore high-quality items, but the girl herself didn't understand this and wore whatever she wanted. Overexcited, Larry was becoming almost frightening in her ways, towering ominously over Elle as she promised to prepare her perfectly for the trip. Not accustomed to such luxury, Elle, having already changed, stood awkwardly, dressed in a chic blue dress, and massive gold earrings adorned her ears. Seeing her, Larry became even more delighted, and Tofu's face expressed extreme shock, and the maid, giggling, assumed that he had fallen in love. Elle, picking up on Larry's mood, asked the dog with a grin if he was really capable of such a thing. Larry stated that both humans and male animals were the same, and Elle asked in surprise if Tofu was a male. The maid suggested checking it out, but the dog got into a fighting stance and then jumped into the closet. He looked at them sullenly from under the half-open doors, and the girls discussed in surprise that sometimes he really did resemble a person. After a while, they went down to the garden, where Elle's carriage was already waiting. A stately man greeted the princess, introducing himself as the Imperial Chamberlain Shudin. Elle thanked him for coming to accompany her, and the chamberlain gave her his hand, helping her into the carriage. Suddenly, Tofu rushed towards them with a loud bark. One of the knights reached for his sword to drive the dog away. The enraged princess shouted at him. She angrily ordered the sword to be removed and explained that it was the dog she had raised. Turning to Shudin, she declared that the dog would go with her. The carriage moved off, and Elle closed her eyes tiredly, taking a deep breath. Then she looked at Tofu seriously and said that it was dangerous to do that, because he was already covered in bruises, and what would happen if he got hurt again? The dog pressed his ears back in shame. She asked him if he was afraid that she would leave him somewhere, and he confirmed this by barking. Lari, laughing quietly, said that he stuck to her like chewing gum, and when the maid stroked him, he was not as calm as with Elle. Soon they arrived at the palace. Elle looked at him nervously, mentally preparing herself for a meeting with the emperor. The chamberlain told us to follow him further. Looking at the interior decoration, the girl thought about how expensive everything around was. Approaching one of the doors, Shudin knocked on it and announced the arrival of the princess. Elle entered a richly decorated room where the emperor sat demurely on a sofa. He looked indifferently at the girl who entered. She bowed politely, greeting the emperor. The emperor invited Elle to sit down opposite her, and she walked awkwardly towards the sofa. She was clearly uncomfortable in the presence of a silent, emotionless man. When she was already languishing with awkwardness, the emperor finally spoke. He began by saying that she had been married for a month now, and asked if she liked the palace, to which the girl replied that, overall, everything was fine. Looking up at Elle, he asked if she had seen the second prince. The girl replied sheepishly that she had only seen him on the day of the wedding, and the emperor asked if they had seen each other since. Feeling as if she were being interrogated, she shuddered and replied. She had to choose the right time to bring up Kapari. The emperor continued that he had called her today to convey something. He places a document in front of her, telling her that it is proof that she has the authority to manage the affairs of the palace. Elle looks at the man in shock as he continues that, although the chamberlain tried very hard to do his job, now she will do it. And since the second prince can't do his job properly, she will have to help. He will also send additional knights and guards to the palace. He then asked if she had anything she wanted to say, but Laella, abandoning her plan to tell the emperor about Kopari, shook her head. She didn't think that she would get what she wanted so easily. Unexpectedly for Shudin, she asks him who she could talk to about corruption. She awkwardly clarifies that, as it seems to her, there were many violations. Shudin assures that in this case, he will inform His Majesty, and he will send someone to her later. Once outside, the girl rushes to Tofu, who was faithfully waiting for her. She hugs him tightly, not paying attention to anyone around her. At this time, the emperor is watching them closely through the window. There is something sinister blazing in his eyes. At the palace, Kapari savors wine, enjoying the solitude. He notes with satisfaction that after that incident, the princess became silent. A few days ago, a very nervous maid entered his bedroom. She told him the princess's words that if something happened to Tofu, he would be in trouble. Now he thought irritably that she must be so rebellious because she was from the Sahad Empire. Now that she was afraid for the dog, she would no longer dare to disturb him. And now all that was left was to think about how to regain power. A maid suddenly burst in and shouted that the princess had returned from the Imperial palace. Kapari, displeased at being so brazenly interrupted, haughtily asked what the big deal was. However, the maid continued in fear that she had returned with the Imperial knights. The chamberlain jumped up in amazement at this news, asking whether the emperor himself had sent them. Nervously biting his nails, he thought that the knights had definitely come at the princess's request to examine everything here thoroughly. He was going to appropriate enough for himself to buy a fake certificate of nobility and then leave this palace. He was so close to it. In a fit of rage, he swept everything off the table and screamed in despair. The wine bottle smashed against the wall, sending out shards of glass and blood-red splashes. The chamberlain breathed heavily, unable to contain all the anger that burned like fire inside him. Having collected his thoughts, he decides to collect all the money and run away. He assumed that such a day might come, so he kept a special record of which nobles he took bribes from, so that with this, he could easily get his money. With a wild look, he opens the drawer in which the records were kept. His eyes widen and his body trembles. There was no report inside. At the same time, the princess was talking with the knights on the street. One of them assured the girl that from now on, she would be safe. Lari thoughtfully suggested that it seemed that Kopari had already discovered that the documents were missing. She asks Elle how she knew exactly where the records were kept in such a huge palace, to which the princess replied that she simply put herself in his shoes. If it were her, she wouldn't allow something so precious to her to be kept too far away. Therefore, one must find such a place without worrying about it raising suspicions if it is found. As the sun set behind the horizon, giving way to a silvery moon in the sky, Tofu peered at his reflection in the clear surface of the water. His features, previously canine, quickly changed, taking on the appearance of a fair-haired man whose real name was Short Ren. He was the emperor's favorite and was soon to become the crown prince until this terrible curse befell him. One day, on the day of the Imperial banquet, a wizard burst into the palace. He shouted loudly, sparkling with purple flashes of magic, that from now on the emperor would live his life like an abandoned dog. But Short rushed forward, covering his father with his body. For a moment he was blinded by a bright flash of lightning, and he took upon himself the curse, turning into a dog. The wizard disappeared, and the mother fainted from shock. The emperor killed all the nobles who were at the banquet, and also sent all the wizards of the country to the guillotine. But everyone still found out about this incident. There were rumors that the second prince turned into a monster and disappeared. Soon after, the mother died of illness, and the emperor began to ignore his own son. Even the nanny was falsely accused and thrown out of the palace, and Shirt could not go outside because he did not want anyone to see him like this. At that time, he thought it was better to have no one around him. But then he met her. He wanted to be close to her, and so he was ready to protect her no matter what. Wounded, he came to his father's palace, bleeding. Ignoring the servant's cries that he needed to treat the wounds first, he swung the door open, meeting the emperor's cold gaze. He asked harshly why the prince had come to him. Shirt explains that he came to ask for a favor, even though it may seem rude. Kneeling before him, he asks him to protect his wife. Later, the reports that Elle found were delivered to the emperor, who was furious that the palace budget was being spent on personal needs. All the nobles involved were beheaded or demoted, and of course Kopari was no exception. The emperor thought that this was even good, because he had a good opportunity to get rid of these parasites. However, he didn't think Shirt would ask for it personally. He had everything to become the crown prince: strategy, courage, a wise look. The first prince, Reynard, lacks such qualities. If only it weren't for this damn curse. Suddenly, he remembers Elle hugging the prince in the form of a dog, and a bright thought comes to mind. He shouted that he knew how to lift the curse from Shirt. The prince had to really fall in love. However, what kind of person can love a dog? However, it is possible that the princess will be able to lift the curse, even though she is the daughter of a duke from the state of Sahad, which tries to attack the empire at every opportunity. But this problem could be solved, and the emperor calls Shudin, saying that he will need to send a gift to the princess. Ella, who had just finished sorting through the reports, stretched with relief. Worried about the girl, Lari noticed that she had been working since early morning. Elle leaned her hands on the table and let out a satisfied sigh, saying that she was glad that she had managed to solve the problem sooner than she thought. She continued that it was all because she had Lari and Tofu, causing the maid to break into a happy smile. With shining eyes, Lari said that she had prepared a really tasty breakfast today. The princess gasped in amazement. The table was simply bursting with various delicacies, and her eyes were running wild. The satisfied maid reported that although the food costs had become much lower, the food was much more luxurious. Now everyone did everything to impress the girl, all because she had the diamond necklace that the emperor had given her last time, which meant that she enjoyed his favor. Suddenly, Lari, thinking that Elle might change her maid because of this, began to fuss around her, assuring her that she was ready to be with her for the rest of her life. The girl smiled, happily saying that she and Tofu were enough for her. Those who chase money and power are the people who will disappear like a mirage when it all disappears. Suddenly, there was the sound of paws pattering, and Elle turned around happily. Tofu rushed into her arms, and the girl, filled with genuine happiness, tenderly hugged the dog. She turned to the dog, asking if he would stay with her for a long time, and he barked affirmatively. Unable to contain her emotion, Elle squeezed him even tighter, admiring the dog's smiling face. She actually sometimes thought that Tofu understood what she was talking about. Deciding to test his skills, The princess asks the dog to give her his paw, and he immediately gives it to her. She pretends to shoot a pistol, and the dog obediently falls on its back. When ordered to roll on the floor, he begins to roll in different directions like a big fluffy ball. The pleasantly surprised girl gives him a piece of meat as a reward. She then invites him to go for a walk, and Tofu barks happily. On the street, they come across maids sorting through a mountain of letters. When asked what it is, Elle is told that these are all invitations to social events, and rolls her eyes in boredom. It seems that even the noble ladies, who had not previously shown any interest in her, had heard rumors that she was enjoying the emperor's favor. But the girl was not interested in this, so she ordered them all to be refused. Having moved a decent distance away, Larry asks if she will continue to decline invitations, to which she receives an affirmative answer. Elle continues that, of course, it would be nice to be friends with the nobles in order to be prepared for any developments. But for now, she did not need it, and she was happy. But after this, invitations and refusals began to be repeated. Every day, the number of letters increased, and poor Larry was practically drowning in a pile of papers. But the lady remained adamant, asking each time for a refusal. When Larry visited 4 days later, the princess was already exhausted by the constant invitations. However, to the girl's great relief, the maid had not come for that reason, but rather to inform her of an invitation to a banquet to celebrate the second prince's birthday. Ella rubbed her temples tiredly, wondering irritably why they were going to hold a banquet in honor of the Beast Prince when they had never held one before. Thinking about what the emperor was trying to achieve, she sat down to write a reply letter with a smirk. She needed to make sure that he wouldn't do such annoying things in the future. She hands the letter to Larry, asking him to send it to Shudin, to which she, noticing her evil smile, worriedly asks if everything is okay. With a frightening look, Elle states that, of course, everything is fine, thinking with anticipation that she will clearly show why Layla is considered the most evil woman in the kingdom of Sahad. Later, the girl was met by Madame Neria, the chief designer of the Imperial family, who arrived on her orders. Elle greeted her with a bit of awkwardness, saying that she relied on Neria to choose her dresses. The princess's cunning plan was to wheedle a lot of money out of the emperor so that no one would want to invite her to such a party. Madame Neria opens before her catalogs with the most fashionable dresses of this season. However, whatever they showed her, Elle did not like. Finally, after looking through all the options, Layla sighed tiredly and asked the woman what style would suit her. She, with a graceful movement adjusting her glasses, declared with a sparkle in her eyes that brighter, rather than pastel, colors would suit her. She suggested raising the waist a little higher and making the sleeves pleated instead of lace. After some thought, the princess agrees. The girl tells Madame Neria to come to her with sketches and prepare clothes for the dog. The woman, thinking she had misheard, asks again in surprise. Ella responds indifferently that Tofu will also go to the party with her. A dismayed Neria exclaims that she cannot put her clothes on dogs. Hearing this, Tofu hangs his head sadly. Picking up the dog in her arms, the princess declares that in this case they cannot cooperate. Madame Neria, unwilling to agree to such conditions, bowed respectfully and said goodbye to the girl. Elle angrily asks Larry to find another designer who will make clothes for the dog. But she, thinking, says that most likely it will be difficult to do because everyone hates dogs. The princess, completely disillusioned with this world, sadly hugged Tofu to herself. She wondered how one could not love this sweet and good dog because he was so loyal that no human could compare to him. The next day, Madame Neria returns with the news that she has changed her mind and will sew clothes for the dog. When asked why she changed her mind, the woman replied that it was the emperor's order. Elle asks again in bewilderment, not understanding why His Majesty needs this. She looks back at Tofu in surprise. With a heavy sigh, Madame Neria got straight to the point, reporting that since there were still 3 months until the banquet, she would have time to sew about 4 dresses. The girl agrees to the chosen design and tells the woman to make sure the fabric is of the highest quality and to also prepare 10 outfits, including clothes for the dog. Madame Neria indignantly notes that she has other orders, so her schedule is very tight. Elle remains adamant, promising to pay 5 times more if the woman changes her schedule. But Naraya counters that she has a very trusting relationship with her clients and cannot do that. The girl ups the ante, saying that she will pay 10 times more in that case, but the woman continues to hesitate. Finally, Elle names a sum 15 times larger and offers to secure her as their permanent designer. Surrendering to such pressure, the woman agrees. The princess's face instantly brightened, and she, smiling radiantly, said that the Imperial family would pay her. In her mind, she calculated how much it would all cost, and she was still planning to choose some jewelry for herself, and that would probably be enough to make the emperor grab his head. And so, the good-natured man was already showing her the jewelry that would suit the princess. Elle's gaze fell on a beautiful, shiny ring. The man at this time showed a richly decorated necklace, saying that it was the most expensive thing they had. Suddenly, Tofu rushed towards him, snatching the necklace from the shocked man's hands with his mouth. The jewelry fell to the floor with a clatter, and shards of stones scattered across the floor. Realizing that all the jewelry was fake, Elle snorted contemptuously and asked threateningly how he dared to palm off a fake on her. He tried to justify himself in fear, but the girl waved her hand at the security guards to escort him out. If a princess came to a party wearing fake jewelry, the noble ladies would immediately notice. Perhaps this man was hired by someone who wanted Elle to be in an awkward situation. It was necessary to find the person who had planned all this. Elle coldly orders everything he brought to be removed and the man's tongue to be cut out so that he can never deceive anyone again. Crying in horror, the man shouted that he was only doing what the Earl of Severn told him to do. He continued that this person belonged to the highest noble faction, so there was nothing he could do about it. It turns out that the noble faction was targeting her. Having ordered the man to be taken to prison, the girl strokes Tofu with satisfaction, praising him for his resourcefulness. However, the girl wondered how Tofu was able to immediately determine that the jewel was fake. She looked closely at his face, taking the dog by the cheeks. Elle screamed in amazement. Could her dog really be a genius? The next morning, Elle woke up earlier than usual, feeling her stomach growl with hunger. The hand came across something soft. Turning her head, she screamed in surprise and again saw that same pervert next to her, peacefully snoring nearby. The man sleepily opened his eyes at the girl's scream. He stared at her in amazement, while the girl calmly asked if he was a prince. The princess asked him to stay and talk, but the man did not listen to her at all. Opening the window wide open, he deftly jumped over it, jumping down. The girl rushed to the window in shock, but there was no one downstairs. Confused, she wondered what it was. At breakfast, Larry asked what was wrong with that pervert, to which Elle responded indifferently that judging by everything, he was her husband. The maid let out a breath of shock at this news. Elle chews thoughtfully as she muses that it is perfectly normal for a legal couple to share a bed together. But he suddenly appears and runs away without even speaking to her. Suddenly, the thought dawns on him that he is not only a monster who turns into a human being at night, but also cannot speak. However, it was unclear why the prince was secretly spying on her as she slept. Larry giggles and suggests that perhaps he liked the princess, but she shakes her head, since they only saw each other during the wedding. The carried-away maid dreamily says that perhaps he watched her from afar, learned that she was a good person, and therefore decided to go to her bed. Choking, Elle denies Larry's allegations and says that she didn't really care what her husband looked like. Anyway, it's just a place from a fantasy romance novel. She really didn't care what he looked like. She just wanted to hope that he would show himself to her confidently, without hiding. Unexpectedly for the girl, Tofu jumps on her out of nowhere. He takes his usual place on her lap and looks at her pitifully, with eyes that are wet, as if from tears. Elle asks worriedly why he is crying. Was the dog afraid that her husband would hate him? Holding him tenderly, she assures Tofu that he is the most beautiful creature on the planet, and that her husband will not judge him by his appearance. Time flew by very quickly, and now the dying summer gave way to autumn. Unlike the bad events in the book, their life was peaceful and calm, and Elle became noticeably happier. Sitting on a soft blanket under the shade of colorful trees, the girl asked Larry if she still received many invitations from noble ladies. She nods with a sigh, answering that the warehouse was already so full that there was simply no space. Lost in thought, Elle thinks that if they are so persistent in sending invitations, then perhaps it would be better to show herself to them at least once. Suddenly, she asks when the prince's birthday is, and Larry, thinking, replies that it is tomorrow. Elle is completely confused as to how time has flown by so quickly. The next day, Madame Neria reports that the princess's clothes are ready. Calling the maid, the woman shows off 3 rich dresses. She then holds out a box, saying that it contains the pants that Elle asked her to make. The girl happily takes out a checkered jumpsuit, admiring it. Neria, pleased with the work done, asks what kind of man she is going to give this gift to. However, Elle shocks the woman with her answer, saying that she will wear it herself. Neria nervously points out that this is not a dress. The girl, kindly placing her hand on her shoulder, asks her not to worry, because she prefers comfortable clothes rather than pretty dresses. She calmly walks away to the fitting room, while the tense woman realizes that they might get into trouble for having the princess in men's clothing. Her Highness will become a laughingstock, and Madame Neria's reputation will sink to the bottom. It was necessary to stop her by any means necessary. She began her speech of protest, but then the princess pulled back the curtains, revealing herself in a new outfit that suited her incredibly. Madame Neria gasped in delight, admiring her beauty. Lari squealed with delight, and Tofu barked happily in response. Pleased with the praise, Elle says that in that case she will wear this particular outfit, but the woman objects, explaining that in the Empire, there is a strict division between women's and men's clothing, so this could cause problems. Elle calmly replies that traditions are of course good, but if you follow them, it becomes less interesting, especially since it's all already outdated. Recalling her native Korea, she says that such comfortable clothes will one day become popular. Madame Neria looks at her with respect, apologizing for jumping to conclusions. Soon they dress up Tofu, who groans from the new sensations out of habit. Elle melts with affection, admiring the beauty of her dog. The girl didn't care if they scolded her. She would still take her beloved Tofu to the party. The day of the banquet arrived, and the princess entered the hall in her new outfit, with the dog walking stately beside her. Everyone began to discuss her with surprise, noting that although the clothes on her looked unusual, they still suited her. Elle stood calmly in front of the throne on which the emperor sat. She bowed respectfully, and the emperor thanked her for accepting the invitation. The girl smiles politely, giggling maliciously in her mind that he hasn't yet seen how much money he had to pay for her presence. Rising from his throne, the emperor loudly announces the beginning of the banquet. Glasses filled with wine were raised up. The sound of glass clink was heard, and the assembled people heartily congratulated the second prince on his birthday. Elle noted with annoyance that the main hero of the occasion was not there, as was the point of this party. Suddenly, someone approached her and asked her in an ingratiating tone whether it was true that she was the daughter of the Duke of Sahad. Turning around with displeasure, she sees in front of her a girl who introduces herself as Robidine Sidel, daughter of the Marquis of Rennes. Elle turned away indifferently. Robidine chuckled maliciously, stating that Sahad was much smaller than Rennes, so the Marquis of Rennes had a higher rank than the Duke of Sahad. The girl choked on her wine from such impudence. She smirked and noted that she was now the Princess of Rennes, so it didn't matter what status she had before her marriage. Covering his face with a fan, Robadin says sarcastically that every princess is different. Faced with Elle's indifference, the girl frowned, declaring that Laella was uneducated and spoke rather harshly, which was expected from a resident of Sahad. Elle coldly says that she is more educated than Levan herself, deliberately confusing the girl's name. As expected, she loses her temper. The princess mockingly asks to understand her situation, because she is from Sahad, so it is difficult for her to pronounce her name, again distorting it. Robidin starts screaming, unable to bear the bullying. Her friend comes to her aid, smilingly asserting that Elle must be simply heartbroken because she could not receive love from her husband. The princess noted that they were both unmarried, to which Robidin's friend nervously asked what the big deal was. Elle grinned and said that she was sorry to hear them say that, because her own worth did not depend on her husband's love. She asked sarcastically if they just liked to hurt others to feel better about themselves, and then continued with a smile that they needed to love themselves first. Robidin asked angrily if she was trying to teach them. Suddenly, a man appeared from behind Robadin, interrupting their discussion. Turning around, the friends bowed in fear. It was the first prince, Reynard Rennes. He asked ingratiatingly if he could speak to the princess alone, and the girls immediately left. The prince smiled mysteriously, asking if she was his brother's wife, to which the princess replied that she was. Tofu growled in warning. Ignoring the dog, Renard introduced himself as the crown prince, taking the girl's hand. Elle smiled awkwardly back, thinking that it probably wouldn't happen. After all, according to the book, the emperor did not have time to conduct the ceremony of transferring the title of crown prince before his death. Reynard flatteringly said that for the good of the empire, she had to marry a monster. He approached her, touching her shoulder with his hand. He whispered in her ear to find him when she needed him, and that he would not treat her badly. Tofu spoke up again, growling menacingly. He lunged at the prince, sinking his fangs deep into his leg, biting through the soft flesh. The man fell to the floor with a groan, clutching his injured limb with his hands. The guards immediately rushed towards them. The prince began to shout in rage that they should kill the maddened dog immediately. Elle hugged Tofu close in horror, screaming at them not to touch him. The guards surrounded the girl, not daring to touch her, and the angry Renard continued to shout for them to kill the dog. The emperor approached and besieged him. He noted that today was too good a day for that. The prince tried to object, showing his father the wound. Then, with a grin, he asked if there had been a single happy day since that monster was born, hinting at the second prince. His father looked at him coldly, ordering him to stop being rude. Reynard tried in vain to escape from the hands of the guards who were trying to take him away. The emperor turned his gaze to Elle, who looked back at him awkwardly. She hoped for his leniency, but he gave a strict order to throw the dog, which dared to bite a member of the Imperial family, into prison. With despair in her eyes, Elle tried to defend Tofu, screaming that he didn't do it on purpose. She called out to Tofu in pain as he was locked inside the cramped cage, and he barked sadly back at her. The princess threw herself at the emperor's feet in tears, begging him not to do this to Tofu, since Renard had been the first to say nasty things to her, and he had only stood up for her. However, the emperor remained adamant. Elle said sadly that everyone deserves to live. The emperor cast a cold glance at her. Without listening to the girl any longer, he turned around and ordered her to return to the palace. He added at the end that he would not kill the dog, because this dog was special. Broken Elle did not understand what the emperor's phrase about the dog being special meant. She tried in vain to understand what he meant. Several days had passed since the princess had returned to the palace, and she wanted nothing more than to lie on her bed and stare at one point. And even Larry, who brought her food, could not cheer her up. She asked her in a detached manner to leave the food and go away. The maid was also worried about the whole situation. Elle looked out the window longingly and thought about Tofu. If you think about it, there really was something strange about him. Also, in the book, everyone who harmed the Imperial family was beheaded, and His Majesty said that he would not kill the dog, because it was special. Tofu was very smart, and he was also too picky about food, which gave the impression that he had been abandoned by some nobles. Moreover, the emperor then ordered Madame Neria to agree to the princess's conditions regarding clothing for the dog. All these oddities led to only one hypothesis, that the prince was not a monster at all, but Tofu. Elle jumped out of bed, amazed by her own guess. She excitedly called Larry to her. She asked her what the second prince's name was, and the maid replied in surprise that his name was Short Ren. Elle then asked if she could find out who was with the prince on the day he was cursed. Later, having found out everything, Larry reported that everyone who was with him that day was already dead. A small number of nobles and servants could attend that banquet. It was said that only the emperor, his wife, and Short himself remained alive. The head maid told her about this, but this information was secret, so Larry was not supposed to talk about it. Elle thought about how carefully everything had been thought out. Suddenly, a thought struck her, and the girl asked if she could ask the head maid for a list of the nobles present. Larry replied guiltily that, as far as she understood, the maid didn't even want to hear about it. Elle nodded in disappointment, realizing that even though it would be dangerous, she would have to figure it out herself. If the events match the book, then a war will definitely start here. And if Tofu really is a prince, then things will only get more complicated. Short was a member of the Imperial family. He could not ignore his people. The princess won't be able to leave Tofu on the battlefield. So if Tofu was a prince, then she wouldn't be able to stay away from the war, which meant she had to be stopped somehow. But first, she needed to find out whether the list of nobles who were present at that moment had been preserved, and only then would she be able to develop the next points of the plan. Elle had managed to steal a pass to the document warehouse and was now tensely hiding behind the bookshelves, wondering how she would be able to find what she needed in such a huge area. Suddenly, someone called out to her from behind. Turning around, she saw a servant in front of her, asking what brought her here. And the girl nervously replied that she just needed to check something. The servant bowed his head respectfully and informed her that she could not enter here unless she was a third-level civil servant. The girl spoke quickly, saying that she liked that the place was properly guarded, and in that case, she would leave right away. Having failed, Elle did not even think of giving up, deciding to return at night. Suddenly, in the hallway, she meets a maid who tells her that Tofu has returned. Elle bursts into the room, shouting the dog's name loudly. With her gaze, she finds the beaten dog. With tears in her eyes, the girl hugs Tofu to herself, asking in a trembling voice how this could happen. The dog devotedly nuzzles Elle's hand. The princess cannot hold back her tears. She was glad he had been saved, but she couldn't understand how someone could have left not a single whole spot on such a small body. An excited Larry hurried after the doctor. Elle lays Tofu on his side, looking at the wounds with concern. The blood did not stop, flowing in scarlet drops from the deep wound. Soon Larry and the doctor burst into the room. The girl realizes that Larry had to lie that the princess was sick because no doctor would come to treat the dog. Elle pointed sadly at Tofu, saying that it wasn't she who was sick, but the dog. The doctor asks again in confusion, to which the girl, ignoring him, asks if he can cure him. He shakes his head, saying that he treats people, not dogs. An enraged Elle harshly says that he means he is not a doctor. She angrily orders him to leave the palace immediately. The doctor objects that he cannot be thrown out simply because he refused to treat the dog, since all doctors would have done the same. The princess coldly remarks that she needs a doctor who will save lives, not stand by. Without listening to his objections, she orders him to be thrown out. Turning to Larry, she asks the maid to make an announcement, saying that she urgently needs a doctor who can save any life, including a dog's, no matter the cost. Then she takes out some medicine from the chest of drawers and wonders if she can give it to the dog, since it is intended for humans. Deciding it was worth a try, she poured the solution into a saucer. Moving the saucer closer to Tofu, the girl asks him to try drinking the potion. He, overcoming the pain from his wounds, gets up and begins to lap up the healing liquid. Then he lay back down, and Elle, stroking him carefully, wondered if she could just ask him if he was her husband. She was more than happy with the fact that Tofu was just a dog, but if he turned out to be human, she wouldn't mind either. After all, she loved him for who he was. She watched the sleeping dog carefully until night fell, and the room was plunged into darkness, lit only by the dim light of the moon. Tofu's appearance began to change until it took on human features. He really turned out to be a man, just as Elle thought. Perhaps Short didn't know his secret was out, and then she would have to wait until he told her directly. Gently touching his head, the girl whispered to him, "Just not to die." The next morning, Elle rubbed her eyes sleepily as she sat up in bed. Tofu woke up and looked at her in bewilderment. The girl happily asked him if he had slept well, pretending not to know anything about it. He shook his head nervously, not understanding how he ended up here. The princess, looking at him with a smile, thought about how fantastic it was that he really did turn into a dog every morning. She informed Tofu that she had also just woken up. Elle opened her arms for a hug and gently called the dog to her. Tofu happily rushed towards her, clinging to his owner. Several days passed, and Elle carefully bandaged the dog's body. She noted happily that he had almost recovered. Suddenly, Larry burst into the room screaming. She dumped out a huge pile of letters, explaining that these were all invitations from nobles. The princess awkwardly noted that she had made a fuss at the second prince's birthday party, and they had decided to send her invitations again. Larry reported that, whatever the case, strange rumors began to circulate. The reason why His Majesty did not kill the dog that attacked the Imperial family was because the princess enjoyed the Emperor's favor. In addition, they also discussed what clothes she appeared in. It looks like these outfits are going to become popular now. Elle had no plans to attend the parties anyway, so she asked Larry to take care of the invitations, as always. Suddenly, Tofu growled menacingly, and the girl turned towards him in surprise. He looked tensely towards the window, behind the curtains of which some shadow was hidden. The dog barked at the top of his voice. Alarmed, Elle pulled back the curtains and discovered a fluffy cat sitting on the windowsill. Tofu continued to bark furiously, and the girl, not paying attention, said admiringly how cute he was. The dog stopped short, looking at the girl in surprise. She continued to be touched, calling the cat to her. The cat slapped her hand away with her paw in displeasure, but Elle continued to admire her, finding even her arrogance charming. The princess, waving her hands excitedly, asked Laurie if cats were also treated with contempt here, and the maid, sighing, replied that they were, and nothing could be done about it. Tofu watched all this sullenly. Larry, giggling cheerfully, said that it seemed the dog was jealous. He just looked at her angrily and turned away with feigned arrogance. Elle laughed happily. Kneeling down in front of the dog, she assured him that he was even cuter than the cat. A rainy night came, and the girl decided that now that she knew that Tofu was the second prince, she could not allow him to live his life like this. She needed to reveal the truth in a way that would not hurt Shirth in any way, and there was only one way to do it. She and her companions stopped in front of a dilapidated house in which a dim light was burning. This was the building of the most famous information guild. Inside, they were met by a man with a scar running across his face, to whom Elle informed that she needed to find one person. With complete indifference on his face, he asked who exactly she was looking for. One of his companions sharply put his sword to his throat, menacingly pointing out that in front of him was a noblewoman, and he should show respect. Elle cut him off, noting that she was fine. She said that she was looking for a commoner who worked as a nanny for the second prince in the Imperial palace. She continued that she had been falsely accused and thrown out, and asked that this person be found. Frowning, the man said that this was no ordinary commoner, but the prince's nanny, therefore the price would be quite high. The girl hands him a bag, declaring that she will give him as much money as he wants. Inspired by this scenario, the man promised that in that case, he would find her as quickly as possible. The next day, Elle and Tofu entered the tavern, where they were greeted by a smiling waitress. Noticing that the girl was not alone, the waitress informed her that dogs were not allowed in the premises. The princess explained that she would simply place an order and wait on the open terrace, to which the waitress replied that this was not possible, and the girl asked a reasonable question: why, if the terrace was not indoors? The people sitting around immediately began to whisper. Elle sighed heavily, realizing that strange rumors would circulate again. However, this was even for the best, because now she would be able to raise her popularity to such an extent that simply no one would dare to send her an invitation. Finally sitting down on the terrace, the girl orders 2 of the most expensive cakes and 2 cups of black tea, one of which was for Tofu, so it needed to be allowed to cool. People around were amazed to hear that all this was so expensive, that common people could not even dream of such a thing. Elle calmly said that she would pay 10 times more, and would also pay for all the guests, so if anyone didn't like something, they could just tell her. The waitress nervously ran to fulfill the order. Suddenly, a sarcastic voice came from behind Elle. Turning around, she saw Robodin with her friends, who said maliciously that she was very glad to see them again. Elle remembered that it was the rude woman she had met at the banquet. Robodin asked her ingratiatingly if she remembered her, to which the girl replied that she did not remember those who were not important to her. Robodin instantly became distorted with bewilderment and anger. Elle began to tease the girl again, mangling her name, and Robodin pouted with anger boiling up inside. Suddenly, she noticed the princess's dog gobbling up the cake. She said sarcastically that Layella's love for dogs suited her very well. Not noticing the mockery, Elle beamed and said that she too would advise her to get a puppy as a pet. Robodin snorted and declared that she had no hobby in raising useless creatures. Taking a sip of fragrant tea, Layella calmly reproached that measuring someone else's life by its usefulness was heartless. She continued that she had the feeling that Robodin was ready to kick people out of her circle if they were no longer useful. Robodin was alarmed by such an abrupt change of topic. Elle noted that she simply said what she thought, and that, whatever the case, she believed that someone's life in itself cannot be useless. The guests surrounding them began to whisper disapprovingly, looking in the direction of the Marquise's daughter. Elle said mockingly that in fact, when she lived in the kingdom, she had a very bad character. However, after meeting Tofu, she became softer. Perplexed, Robodin asked her again what it meant that she had become softer, and the girl replied that she had had depression that no one could cure. But then she recovered. One of Rabadin's friends awkwardly raised her hand, asking if it was true that dogs could help with some emotions. The princess nodded, smiling radiantly. At night, the girl tried in vain to fall asleep, but sleep just wouldn't come to her. She was terribly curious about what Short was doing now. She got out of bed, wrapping herself in a shawl, realizing that she wanted to see him. Under the light of the silvery moon, the prince sat on the ground, leaning against the trunk of a spreading tree and contemplating the sparkling surface of the water. Out of breath from running, Elle stopped nearby. Hearing someone's footsteps, Shirt turned around in confusion. Everything inside him shook, and the prince started to run. But the girl's loud voice stopped him. Elle bowed politely and said softly that she wanted to get closer to him. The man, having listened to her request, nevertheless turned around to leave. However, Elle, not intending to give up, desperately grabbed his hand. Short spoke to her for the first time, saying that if they were together, the curse would spread. Smiling, the girl asked why he got married then. She apologized for grabbing the prince's hand and asked him not to run away again if he didn't mind talking. The man sighed resignedly. Elle sat down on the grass near him, and there was silence for a few seconds. The girl spoke first, asking if she could call him Mr. Shirth, and he said yes. She noted that he could call her Lela or Elle, whichever he preferred. She shared that she had heard that the prince had a nanny and asked if he was interested in how she was doing. Short replied in an indifferent voice that he had not. Elle didn't expect such an answer, so she asked again, dumbfounded, if he really didn't want to meet her. The prince dejectedly said that it would be better for him not to get involved with anyone. It was enough for him that he knew she was doing well, so there was no need to look for her. Elle thought with disappointment that the nanny was the only one who stayed with Shirt until the end, and he would definitely want to meet her. The girl carefully said that she had in fact already made a request to the Information Guild, and if she found out her address, she would definitely tell it to him. The prince tried to refuse the offer, but Elle insisted that he might change his mind. Short fell silent, looking down sadly. The dawn sun slowly rose over the horizon, illuminating the earth with its first rays, and the girl stood up, noting how much time had already passed. Turning to the prince, she asked if it was time for them to say goodbye. Short quietly stated that he hadn't really talked to anyone in a long time, so it was difficult for him, to which Elle understandingly replied that if he talked to her more often, then he could get used to it. With a slight blush on his face, the prince carefully asked if she would come to him more often. Smiling broadly, the girl replied that she would come whenever he wished. The prince objected that it was dangerous. When the princess asked him what he meant, the man fell silent again. The girl noted to herself that it was difficult to make the prince speak, while in his dog form he barked at any reason. Finally, Short spoke sadly, saying that in that case he would get too used to her, but if he gets used to someone, then that person will leave him over time. When Elle first learned that she was a character in a book, she had a very difficult time because everything that was in the original world was gone, and everything was unfamiliar to her. But then she had Lari and Tofu, who became dear to her, and she was also afraid that she would lose them, so she understood Short's words like no one else. That's why the girl now confidently said that there was no point in worrying about the prince being left alone someday. Besides, he can make sure that she never leaves him. Winking, the princess said that she was not going to leave the man alone. Gently squeezing his hands, she declared that she would try to make the prince get used to it. So she asked him not to be afraid to get used to her, and at that moment, Short smiled sincerely for the first time in a long time. They continued to hold hands under the rays of the rising warm sun, warming not only from the outside, but also from the inside. Elle woke up late because she had spent the whole night with Shirt. Apparently, he was tired too, as he was fast asleep next to her in his dog form. Lari, who had entered, anxiously asked if she was sick, because the maid had tried to wake the princess, but she would not wake up. Elle answered awkwardly that it was all about fatigue. Lari reported that she received a letter from the Information Guild. Hearing this, Tofu immediately jumped up and walked up to the girl, looking at the letter. Smiling, the princess realized that Schwerte was still interested in learning about the nanny. She began to open the letter, and the dog tilted his head with interest. Inside was a message that 36-year-old Ramini had died in a carriage accident just after leaving the Imperial Palace. Tofu instantly drooped, staring sadly into space. Larry asked excitedly what was in the letter. Elle swallowed nervously, feeling her stomach twist. Suddenly, Tofu jumped up, and the maid called out to him in confusion, but he didn't pay attention. She suggested that he was ill, and Elle, getting out of bed, said that she would go after him. The nanny was dear to the prince, and he must have been in unbearable pain right now. The girl found Tofu in a remote, quiet place, looking absent-mindedly at the iridescent fountain. Elle sat down carefully next to him, asking him to stay close to her. It is not easy to accept any death, and perhaps the nanny's death was one of the disguised cases of murder after the prince was cursed. Short must be one of those who knows the truth better. Tears began to flow from the dog's eyes, and the girl worriedly asked him not to cry. Picking him up in her arms, she offered to tell him something interesting. Laying Tofu on her lap, she began to tell the story of Snow White. She continued to speak soothingly until the dog finally fell asleep. Hugging him tightly, the girl soon passed out herself. She woke up when the sun had already disappeared behind the horizon, and the sky had turned dark blue, and Tofu was no longer nearby. Suddenly, Elle remembered that she had to meet Short that night. She ran as fast as she could to their meeting place. The prince sat in his usual place, looking into the distance. He turned to her, greeting the girl with a slight smile. Noticing how the girl's breath was out of control, he asks in surprise if she ran, and she replies that she did, because she thought the man was waiting for her. She squeezes his hand tightly. Shuerte's cheeks instantly flushed scarlet at the girl's touch. Seeing this, Elle worriedly asks what happened. The man points at her hand, embarrassed. The girl quickly removes her hand and apologizes, saying that she completely forgot herself. She muses that when the prince turns into Tofu, he doesn't mind being touched. It seems like she needs to touch him more often to get him used to it. She suddenly gives him the command to give her hand, and he obediently does so, forgetting that he is not in the form of Tofu now. When it finally dawns on him, he suddenly stops short and looks at his own limb in amazement. Elle laughs cheerfully, noting how obedient the prince is. The same one, completely confused and embarrassed, pulls his hand away and looks away. However, Elle intercepts her, offering to hold hands just for today if he doesn't like it. Short is completely embarrassed, but agrees to the proposal. The girl decides that she needs to talk about something good for his sake. The prince suddenly asks to tell about that old story, meaning the one that the girl told him in the form of Tofu, and immediately stops short. The man immediately tries to justify himself by making up a story about how he accidentally overheard them while passing by. The girl, giggling in her mind at how sweetly he justifies himself, strokes his hair and asks him what point he has listened to. He answers, and Elle continues the story, immersing the prince in the world of a fairy tale. They lie together on the moonlit ground, talking. Suddenly, Elle asks why the prince doesn't call her by name. Shurth sheepishly explains that he feels like if he calls the girl by her name, there will be no turning back, because then he will want to call her by name over and over again. He ends by saying that he will say her name when he is ready, and the girl is amazed to think that what he is saying now is much more complicated than just saying her name. Suddenly she rises, struck by the thought that she does not want to hide anything from this man. Short stands up after her, looking at her in surprise. Gathering her courage, she confesses that she is not really Layla. A little awkwardly, but gradually, the girl thought that they could get closer. But with secrets, it was harder. The more Short lies, the harder it will be for him to speak, and even more difficult to come up with excuses. And she also didn't want to keep secrets from such a beautiful and innocent man. So, clenching her hands tightly into fists, she decided to tell the truth and meekly asked to be called by her real name next time. The prince, perplexed, asked her again what this meant. The girl awkwardly explained that the body really did belong to Layla, and it was all difficult to explain. She asked him directly if he believed in the transmigration of souls. After all, in fact, she was a person from another world, but then suddenly found herself in this world and in another body. The girl sincerely wanted Short to believe her. The prince asked where her real body was then. However, she herself did not know the answer to this question, whether she was alive in that world or not. She never really thought about it seriously, and in fact, there was a chance that, despite being hit by a truck at high speed, she was still alive. However, if not, then her parents probably had a hard time coming to terms with their daughter's death. Suddenly, Short asked if she would ever be able to return to her world. Looking at him with longing, Elle replied that she couldn't know that either. She said that she was actually in complete denial at the beginning, so she became depressed and wanted to die. But strangely enough, she began to get used to all this. She had Lari, who became more valuable to her than just a maid, and Tofu, who brought happiness into her life. And now, including Shuert, she had 3 people who were valuable to her. That's why she didn't want to lose this world just like that. Short touched her gently, asking if it would be shameless of him to ask her not to go anywhere. Elle beamed and grabbed his hand in shock, asking if this meant he believed her. The prince replied that yes, since she said so. He shared that at first he was surprised, because she approached him without the slightest hesitation, even when he was called a monster. And then he was scared, because he thought that she, a kind person, would leave him somewhere. In fact, after she took his hand, he began to have recurring dreams about her leaving him. Elle's eyes widened in surprise, amazed at the prince's thoughts. Shuert squeezed her hand and confessed that he didn't care if she was a stranger from another world. He just wanted her to promise that she wouldn't leave him. For him, this was the most important thing. With a gentle smile on her face, Elle assured him that she would not leave him just like that. Short asked what her name was before she came to this world. The girl happily replied that her last name was Sun, and her first name was Irin. Short repeated her name, savoring the sound of it on his tongue. A delighted Irina exclaimed enthusiastically, pressing her cheek to the man's palm. Irina admitted that after talking with him, she felt much better, because no one knew about this before him. So, from that moment on, he could also tell her something honestly. After these words, Short stopped abruptly, calling the girl. He quietly revealed that he actually had something he couldn't tell. Irina thought that he would say this sometime later, but she would never have thought that it would happen today. The prince was noticeably nervous, unable to say what he was going to tell the girl. The man grabbed his head and began to tremble slightly. Irin immediately ran up to him and sat down next to him, trying to calm Short down. She hugged him tenderly, knowing that because he had been isolated from the others for so long, it was difficult for him to tell the truth. She assured the man that it was okay that he couldn't talk about it, and he could tell her the truth when he was ready. Gathering his courage, the prince raised his head, intending to tell everything. However, they were interrupted by someone's voice insistently calling for the princess. Short stood up abruptly, throwing out a parting word that they would see each other again, and disappeared into the deep thickets. Irina looked sadly after him when a sobbing Larry rushed towards her. The maid did not find her in the room, so she began to worry a lot. Irina, shocked by Larry's reaction, apologized and suggested going home. Taking one last look at the bushes where Shuert had disappeared, the girl wondered if the day would come when she would be able to hear the truth. The first thing Irin sees when she wakes up in the morning is Tofu's face, looking sadly at her. She happily hugs the dog, saying how nice it is to see him this morning. The girl suddenly noticed that Tofu's heart was beating very fast and wondered if he was nervous, and her heart was pounding for some reason. She said nervously that she would tell Larry that it was time to serve breakfast. Irina went out into the corridor, calling Larry. However, instead of her, he runs into another maid. She excitedly announces that Mr. Reynard has arrived. They tried to calm him down, but he kept demanding that they give him the dog. Irene, irritatedly thinking of Renard as a psycho, decided to go to him herself. She took Tofu into the room and laid him down on the bed, asking him to wait for her there. The dog whined pitifully, not wanting to let the girl go alone. However, Iron assured him that it was too dangerous, so he shouldn't go out. After leaving the room, the girl ordered the maid to report this situation to the emperor as soon as possible. She was sure that since the emperor knew that Tofu was Shuert, he would definitely come to the rescue. Walking further, she suddenly came across Reynard, who was mocking poor Larry, who was meekly enduring the blows of the first prince. Tears came to her eyes, but she remained silent. Irene rushed towards her, but Renard blocked her path, mockingly greeting the princess and calling her trash. He angrily asked where she hid that bastard, meaning Tofu. Irin, not afraid of the prince's attacks, only looked at him with irritation. She walked on, ignoring Renard. She approached one of the servants, who looked at her nervously, not understanding what awaited him. Suddenly, she swung her leg and brought it down hard on the servant's leg, pushing through the flesh with her heel. He screamed, bent double in pain. Irina asked angrily how they dared to come here and make such a noise. She continued, turning to the servant, asking if his boss was indulging in his whims. Shouldn't he, as a subordinate, stop him? An enraged Reynard drew her attention to himself. However, Irin immediately threw his hand off her shoulder, menacingly asking if she had said something wrong. The shocked prince cursed, then said that he thought that since the emperor was generous to her, then he too would follow his example. The princess angrily told him not to even think about it, and noted that swearing was impolite. He asked her again, amazed. Others might have tolerated the prince's insults, but Irene was not going to, so she declared that he had understood everything correctly. Outraged by being addressed informally, Reynard roared. To this, the princess calmly replied that despite the fact that he was a prince, he had to observe the basic principles of etiquette. But, apparently, Reynard didn't even know the basics. The prince screamed in anger, causing Irene to cover her ears with a carefree look. Then she said sarcastically that it was okay if he didn't know, because he could always learn. And at the end, she mockingly called him a bastard. Reynard finally lost his temper and shouted, asking what gave her such faith that she thought she could behave in such a way. Irina calmly pointed behind him, saying that the answer was there. The prince turned around in amazement. Behind him were the Imperial knights, led by Shudin. The chamberlain bowed politely, greeting both of them. He said that by order of His Majesty, he had come for the first prince, Reynard Wren. The knights grabbed the prince by the arms, intending to take him away, to which he indignantly tried to fight back. He threw out at the end that he would definitely get Elle and that bastard. She, not fearing the man's threats, indifferently showed him the middle finger. When the prince was finally taken away, the princess sighed wearily. She approached Larry with concern, asking if everything was okay, to which she happily replied that she and the other maid were fine. Shuding apologized for causing them trouble and said that the emperor would make sure that the first prince did not bother her again. Irina, hugging Larry, replied that she hoped so. In fact, she didn't believe it at all. Seeing how much poison there was in Reynard's eyes, it was hard to believe that he would back off. Entering the room, Irin let the girl go ahead, saying that they needed to treat her. Suddenly, both of their eyes widened in horror. Scarlet blood flowed from Tofu's paw, spreading in spots across the carpet. Irina immediately left all her worries behind, because now she was most worried about the dog. Apparently, he tried in vain to open the door with his paw, which is how he injured her. Larry immediately rushed to get the medicine. Irin had tears in her eyes, and she gently took Tofu's paw, sadly calling him a fool. She warned me that it would hurt and asked me to be patient. Tofu hung his head dejectedly, whining quietly. Soon Irene bandaged his paw and also smeared Larry's wounds with a healing potion. After this, the girl sat down tiredly at the table. Tofu whined guiltily as he looked at her. She turned around, and the dog instantly rushed into her arms, which made Irina smile. She explained that she didn't go with him because she was afraid that something would go wrong. And if the same thing happened, she would do the same thing anyway. Tofu shook his head in protest, barking indignantly. The princess threatened that if he acted recklessly again, she would bathe him herself, patting him on the back, and kiss him 500 times. The dog froze instantly. Irina realized with satisfaction that he seemed to have understood everything so well. At the same time, the first Prince Reynard drank away his humiliation by destroying everything around him. He wondered with displeasure what the emperor was thinking when he took the side of the princess and the dog. Before that, he had shouted furiously at his father, asking why he was so protective of the second princess. He grinned evilly and suggested that perhaps she was his secret lover. The emperor immediately gave him a resounding slap, declaring that he would receive his punishment when he sobered up. Reynard was sure that the emperor and the princess were in cahoots, and there was a high probability that it was connected with Shurth. Since childhood, the first prince compared himself to his brother. Even after he turned into a monster, he had a wife who ignored Reynard. Having opened a new bottle, the first prince decides to find out what kind of relationship these two have. He drunkenly called the butler to him. He immediately goes to him, turning to the prince with concern, and he orders that the Marquis of Tenero be called immediately. At this time, 2 knights, the heads of the 2nd and 4th regiments of Imperial Knights, come to the princess, who wanted to ensure better protection. Irene greeted them politely, smiling and saying that she relied on them. A more experienced second in command will accompany her directly. The fourth took on the complete protection of the palace. Of course, there was also the opportunity to control close associates through Larry, because in the fantasy world, the main characters suffer most from their inner circle. At dinner, Irene asked the second in command if he could accompany her at night. She explained that she actually saw Shurt every evening. Laurie was amazed, because the princess never told her about this. She asked indignantly if this meant that Elle had met him the night she went missing, and Irene replied with a smile that it was true. She apologized to Larry as she picked up Tofu. Elle warned that Shuerte might be scared that someone else was with her. Bowing his head, the knight promised that in that case, he would accompany her at a distance. Laurie suddenly asked what the second prince was like, because according to rumors, he was a terrible person. Irina assured that he is very kind and good, and sometimes sweet. Tofu immediately beamed, barking happily. At night, the princess came to her usual place, where a fair-haired man was waiting for her. Irina ran up to him happily, saying what a pleasant wind there was today. Sitting down on the grass, the prince asked to be called Shuel, which was his nickname when he was younger. Ella noted happily how similar their names were. Shurt blushed and said sheepishly that he liked it too. Here Irin reminded that the prince wanted to say something last time. She assured him that the man could tell her about it when he was ready, and said that she was very glad that he allowed her to call him by his nickname. After that, they talked for a long time. Shurt said sheepishly that if he seemed timid, he was not. Irina was surprised by this, but with a radiant smile, she assured him that she understood him.